Hello and welcome to the Can We Ask You This podcast. My name is Corey.
And I'm Rosalind.
And we are so grateful and thankful for you joining us today. This podcast is a place to hear real stories from real people, gain perspective, get uncomfortable, and maybe even create some change. We want to hold space and give a voice to people who have maybe been hurt by the church or wonder if they have a place. This podcast is about listening, learning, and truly seeing each person as invaluable in the eyes of God.
Yeah, and today's guest is Erik, and he's somebody that lives life in a wheelchair. It's going to be a really great episode, kind of hearing a bit of his story, how he got into a wheelchair, because he wasn't born in a place where he needed a wheelchair. And then we're going to dive into just some practical things that we can do as a church culture, but as a society in general, to just be a little bit more welcoming and make things a little more accessible and have a little more understanding.
Yes, so we're excited to hear Erik's story, and let's jump in. Well, welcome, Erik.
Oh, thank you, Corey. It's good to be here.
Yes, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
I'm so glad that you can be here in person. That's awesome.
Yes. It's pretty exciting to be here. As I was sharing with you a little bit earlier, this is my first time back in First Alliance since pre-COVID. So it's been really life-giving and exciting to kind of get that feeling as you wheel up to the doors and realize, wow, this is live and in person. So,
Yeah, I think a lot of people are probably still in the online, which is great, online world, but it is different just coming in person to places and getting kind of back to the way things were.
Mm-hmm. And we're so excited for you to share your story, your journey with the listeners, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say. And I know you're prepped. I know you have lots to say, so we're ready to listen.
Yeah. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself, kind of where you grew up, hobbies, that kind of thing, and that'll sort of set the stage for your story.
Sure. So let the floodgates go, eh?
Right.
So, here we go. I grew up in Calgary. Most of my family is back out east in southern Ontario, mostly in Hamilton and the GTA area. Yeah, grew up here, and my mother went to an Anglican church, so I was raised in an Anglican church. Went to a Catholic school when I was younger, and I was pretty athletically involved. I was a big kid, and by the time I was 15 years old, I was 6'1", 210 pounds, ready to go for the football field, right? So that was me. And then things kind of took a real turn in 1994, something your listeners probably can't see over the airwaves here. I was involved in a very major car wreck in April of 1994, which resulted in me being a incomplete quadriplegic at the C4-5 level and the T4 level. I have two injuries to my back, as well as I had multiple other injuries, which resulted in me being in hospital for about 8 months of that year, and was, of course, a traumatic shift in my life at that point.
So what's an incomplete quadriplegic?
Yeah, incomplete quadriplegic. One thing I tell people is that when a person ends up with a spinal cord injury, no one spinal cord injury is the same. Everybody presents different levels of paralysis, different abilities that present themselves in the body. I mentioned that I have two specific spinal cord injuries at the C4-5 level and the T4 level. My T4 level break is complete, which means that my spinal cord was completely severed at basically the mid-chest level, and I have no sensation or muscle control below that.
Wow.
Whereas the C4-5 level, the cervical area, which is basically just above your shoulder line on your neck, it was compressed and there was some nerve damage, but it wasn't complete. And there is some levels of what they call return. So while some people at a C4-5 level are completely unable to maneuver their hands or their arms, I am. And so a lot of people mistake me for a paraplegic, where I am actually a incomplete quadriplegic. I have difficulties with my right arm and hand.
So can you talk a little bit about, you had this amazing athletic career, and then all of a sudden that's different. I know it was a long time ago, but can you talk a little bit about what that was like for you?
Yeah. How old were you when the accident happened?
Yeah, so I was 15 years old when I was in the car accident. And, it caused a lot of internal questions of identity, of who am I, what is going to happen in my life, what do I expect for the future. Prior to that, I had expectations of looking for scholarships for sports and athletic type activities. I had hopes of building on my physicality and who I was in the very physical, I don't know if it's the right word, but dominating character. Whereas now my world has, borrowing the words from Pastor James there the couple weekends ago, my world had significantly shrunk, and my understanding of who I was had significantly changed. I tell people it's a real rebirth. It's a real rebirth.
I can only imagine. And that would be, especially at 15, where you are figuring out questions of identity and where your place is in the world. And all of a sudden you find yourself in a group that you never thought you'd be a part of.
Yeah. I think, too, one of the things that dramatically impacted that change of identity in me as well was, as a person who only had his learner's license, my mother was also in the vehicle with me, and I was driving, but of course I had to have a licensed person with me, and my mother was in the vehicle. And as a result of that car accident, she passed away.
I'm so sorry.
And I was left in a world where I was pretty much on my own. Wow. And began my independent life in that time period. So
I'm so sorry. That has to be a lot for a 15-year-old to carry on top of everything else. How did you go through that grief process while you're also grieving your own life that you had imagined?
Wow. I'm not going to say it's the same for everyone. I think in some ways it is. At least my hope is that it is. But I think God and the Spirit really prepare someone for traumatic events, for those roads in Damascus type moments. I remember distinctly, prior to the accident, walking down the street, and I was bouncing a basketball, as I was often doing, and I felt this kind of real voice inside me, this internal voice that asked me, how would you like to be in a wheelchair for the rest of your life?
Whoa.
And, I grew up around people in wheelchairs. Ironically, my mother actually worked in a rehabilitation unit as a nursing assistant for those who have had spinal cord injuries. I flipped through photographs of some of the early Paralympic games that my mother was at of people in wheelchairs. And I heard this question, but the way I took it in was, wow, this would make me truly unique. This would make me maybe cool. And I thought, yeah, I could handle being in a wheelchair for the rest of my life. Not realizing the whole depth and understanding and the challenges that brings with it. I think it goes towards, as we might talk about later, our definitions and meanings behind the word disabled. For me, it had at that time, I'm going to say shallow, but a different meaning.
I'd love to hear after you're 15, you're processing traumatic experiences in your life. Yeah. What did that look like going into adulthood for you?
Yeah. Life was not always easy when I was a kid. I was forced to grow up pretty early. And then this was kind of course, a huge catalyst to really growing up. I would not say it was easy. It was not always easy. There was lots of time of being alone and feelings of lost time. I would say it was probably took another year or so afterwards before community started coming around me and really kind of moving me in a direction that supported some of the self-discovery moments that I would go through. I moved into a group home called the Fourth Dimension. We called it 4D, and began to have others around me who had disabilities and show me that life continues and life goes on. I made mistakes along the way, of course, learning how to try and fight for, financial assistance with age and such. I was in a real age gap, a real age bubble in that moment where I was basically told I was too old for child financial assistance from the government, and I was too young for age.
Oh.
And because I was not in school at the time or full time, I couldn't even benefit from student financial aid. So I had to learn very early how to fight for those social assistances to support my independent life in the community.
Wow. And you had to do that on your own because you didn't have a parent there to advocate. Is that right?
Mostly, I had social workers and community that had gone through the similar roads around me that would help guide me. But mostly it was working on my own.
So just kind of going back to what you mentioned earlier about definitions and defining the word disability, I would love for you to kind of help the viewers understand what is the correct word to use, what's not, or kind of like maybe share about your journey with the word disability.
Yeah, okay. So as I began to find a bit of a foothold in life in a wheelchair and began to really find a sense of self, I really felt a desire to return to this faith that I grew up. I began to ask the question of who is the God that I grew up with?
So you grew up believing in God?
I grew up in, as I said, the Anglican Church.
Okay, yeah.
In a Catholic school. I had an understanding of God. I wouldn't say that relationship was solid.
Okay.
I saw it as a weekend activity,
Right.
a community to be involved in. God for me existed, but I don't know if I had a relationship with him.
Okay.
Yeah. So it was after that I really wanted to return to this. And I remember distinctly having this moment in the basement of our house. I was married in '99 to a wonderful woman, Bonnie. And she too is in a wheelchair as well, just so your listeners have a bit of context. And in the basement, I was kind of meditating after being taught how to meditate in the martial art community I was involved in. And I was trying to empty myself, and I asked, I really felt this sense of, rather than nothingness, there was a real presence there with me. And I asked this presence that, God, if you're real, if you're really real, then like Moses in the desert, I need to see you. And this presence really washed through me, and there was a real transformation that took place here in the early 2000s. It thrust me into really diving into Scripture, really reading the Bible for myself rather than having it read to me. Mm-hmm. Really asking the deeper questions of theology and that, and it thrust me into my studies where I ended up with my bachelor's of theology. Coming out of that bachelor's of theology, I began to get involved with house church communities. Bonnie and I opened our own house church in our home in 2008 after a trip to Vancouver and meeting Alan Hirsch and Alan Roxborough out there and hearing about this missional movement. And then as we grew and became more and more involved, we also got involved with a house church network called The Edge. These are things that really shaped who I became. And I became part of the leadership team there, looking at a network of house churches across Canada. And I started my master's studies with Rochester and got my master's in religious education and focusing on missional leadership. In the midst of all of this, there was always this undertone of, you should be in a disabilities ministry. And I always resisted it because I felt like I'm more than just my wheelchair. I'm more than just the disability that I struggle with. And I explored greatly throughout that time and even wrestled with, I'm not disabled. The very definition of disability is a physical or mental condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities. And I felt like I'm not limited in any way. The potential for my life is always there, that as God, as Scripture says, you can do all things through Christ who strengthens you. So I can do all things. I'll find a way. It might be different than someone else, but I can do it. So I'm not disabled. But diving deeper, I really appreciate sharing that Betty Price does in her book, The Space Between Us, because she shares these 3 growth experiences, which I think really I went through unconsciously, but I recognize now. And that is this sense of the defined self, which is this, yes, I have a history behind me. I have a culture that has shaped me, and disability has a place in my life. There are certain things that I cannot do, just as there are certain things that others are unable to do. You guys have disabilities, things that you cannot do in your character. Paul talks about in, I think, Acts 17, that he describes that God has set our boundaries and our limitations, right?
Yeah.
So there are certain defined characteristics within us of our disability. Then there's also the ego, where we create biases within ourselves. We create fears and stuff that steers away. As I said, my earlier character steered away from disability. What was it that made me afraid to acknowledge my disability? What were the biases I had towards that? And to really wrestle with that and set it aside so that I can discover the true story that God's trying to tell through me. Then there's the deeper self, and the deeper self is the sense in our character that connects us to others. It's that sense of imago Dei, or as God says, the image within each one of us that makes us human, that makes us related. So when I think of defining disability, I think it's important that we pay attention to not only our own stories, our own understandings of disability, but see the story of disability in others and acknowledge the story of disability in others, so that together we form a community that finds that deeper story, God's story of disability amongst all of us.
That's good.
That perspective that you said too, like it makes it less of an us and them thing when it's like, yeah, I have disabilities too. I have things
All
I
of
cannot
us.
do. Yeah, we all have something, and so I appreciate that level of understanding you were sharing. And it must have been very confronting to go through that and see that in your own self and see that in your community, and I don't know, developing that new understanding of the word. Okay, so what has it been like for you in different contexts, but especially the church, navigating the practicalities of living life in a wheelchair, and different obstacles that maybe people don't necessarily think about? And that could also be social obstacles that people don't think about, as well as physical.
I think what we're looking for is learning experiences for people when we think about how we do life in community.
Yeah.
I want to hear your perspective of what it's like as even someone in a wheelchair.
Yeah.
Like how can we support you better?
Yeah.
How can you open up our eyes to a world that is different, like a different perspective,
Sure.
viewpoint?
I always try to keep an upbeat tone when I talk about life in a wheelchair, and perhaps that's even a fault. I think it's important that we do pay attention to the fact that things are not wonderful, rosy, and great for people with disabilities all the time in the community. There are a lot of social justice issues at play right now in Canadian society. Share a bit of some stories that I've experienced. One maybe from within the church, and maybe one from without. Sure. I mentioned earlier I was in my undergraduate studies for my theology degree, and they did a weekend where I was to go speak at a church here locally in Alberta and present the sermon. But I was pulled aside before the weekend by the college president into his office to speak with him, and he was very apologetic and very comforting and understanding. But he had the difficult challenge of explaining to me that this church asked me not to preach that weekend, out of the reasoning that if I was unable to get out of my wheelchair and step into the pulpit to present the sermon, that they did not wish for me to preach. This presented a huge eye-opener for me
Wow.
as to the visibility and invisibility of those in wheelchairs within the church. Now, I recognize that that is just a one particular event. I'm not going to say that it hasn't happened again or that there are other examples. But I think it's important to recognize that labels exist. And the old adage question within the Gospels of why is this person born blind or why is this person disabled? It's still being asked by Christ's disciples in the church today, and Jesus' voice needs to be heard. Not so that they can necessarily even be healed, and then therefore be able to present the gospel or therefore be able to find place in the church, but rather so that the glory of God can be seen in the place that they are in that very moment.
That's so good.
I think, in the social world, I spoke with a friend this past week. He's a Muslim, and we began discussing the movement towards euthanasia in our society today. It is so easy for us to present a focus on dying with dignity rather than presenting, as Jesus calls us to, a life of fulfillment, a life-giving culture that says you have a place to and a role to play here in society. And I know that is still being challenged today in social justice movements and conversations across Canada. We cannot label those that are in a place of suffering as a place that is a culture of death. We need to bring in a culture of life into that community of suffering, and ask, how do we build them up? How do we say dignity is found in more than just your dying?
Yeah. Well, it was just, as you say that, we're leading up to Easter while we record this, and I'm thinking, my goodness, Jesus died the least dignified death, and yet it led to so much life everlasting, right? And so I like what you say about that, just bringing a culture of life into somewhere where we somehow glorify death, making it sound better than suffering. So to follow up then, what are some practical ways that we can do a better job of connecting with people who are in a disabled community?
I remember a long time ago, when 2008, I met Alan Hirsch, and we developed a good friendship. He shared a few years after that 4 P's of evangelism. And really, I took them to heart. And I think they became kind of a guide for any kind of relationship building. It doesn't have to be evangelistic. It's simply a way that we build relationships with one another. The first being presence. Presence is the making room for those with disabilities to be part of our life, but also vice versa. You think of, the story that comes to mind is the story of Mephibosheth with King David, where he didn't just, acknowledge him being in the presence of Mephibosheth, being part of his life, but he invited him to the head table to take part of, an acknowledgement that he too had authority. He too had a sense of power within the shaping of David's kingdom, and probably maybe even more so than what he experienced in his his father Saul's kingdom. Where he had a presence there. I remember one time, and this is almost down to the healing of the paralytic, where Bonnie and I were invited over to her cousin's house for Christmas. And when we got there, we actually couldn't fit through the front door. Oh. And so her cousin's husband literally, I'm not kidding, ripped the door off the front of the house.
At Christmas?
At Christmas, winter. Yeah, no kidding. So
What?
it was such an impactful moment. And they carried us through the front door. It was a duplex, so they carried us up the stairs too. And we had a wonderful time. Leaving that evening, I remember Bonnie in her power chair. They were carrying her out, and they accidentally dropped her in the snow.
Oh, like she tipped out.
She tipped over backwards. So she's laying in the snow. And what does she start doing? But she's making snow angels in the snow. And you know, I mean, and it's been years since she had done that. I mean, those are things you never forget. I think one of the other ways to really engage the community, particularly those with disabilities around you, visible disabilities, is the practice of proximity. Proximity is taking that sense of presence and recognizing the ways that we entwine with one another, that our characters are connected. I mentioned earlier about exploring defined and the defined self, the defended self, and the deeper self. Ask those questions of yourself. When you think of your defined identity, ask yourself, what are my disabilities? What are the defended biases and egos that prevent me from seeing those disabilities? And acknowledging my relationship to those that also have visible disabilities or invisible. And the deeper story, ask the deeper question. Why is God asking me to be involved with the community? Why is God calling me to be in relationship with those who have physical presentable disabilities? This is proximity. Powerlessness, man, I can't speak enough to the practice of powerlessness. A lot of times, I think, particularly in the church, we see those with disabilities as the mission. We're here to, whether it be serve them and help them and be their savior, to be their healer. We want to be the ones who heal them. Rather, the sense of powerlessness is, willing to engage them with simply a spirit of love. Jesus asked Peter, "Do you love me?" Right? Not, "What are you doing for me?" Not, "How are you fulfilling my mission?" But, "Do you love me?" And I really love the words that I pulled out of John Anezu and his collection of writings in Uncommon Ground. He describes this, and it ties to dignity too. Our dignity as humans does not come from how hard we work, or where we are from, or what we produce, or how capable we are of any activity. It comes rather from the fact that as God's good creatures, we are loved and known by God. And so as we try to build the dignity of life in those around us, particularly those who struggle with visible disabilities, let's share and build into a spirit of love. And that not only is in the spirit of powerlessness, but becomes a power itself. Proclamation is kind of the last practice in the 4 Ps. I think the reality is as we spend time with one another, proclamation is simply something we realize and something that becomes part of that relationship. We see great truths in one another. We talk about inspiration, right? Well, for a person with a disability, saying that we're an inspiration, no, we don't want to hear that we are an inspiration. We just want to experience it. We want to find that by you also becoming an inspiration, right? You are an inspiration to us in the way that you love us freely, and that you allow us to become part of the community as a whole, an equal partner.
Well, thanks for that invitation, I think. And I think in the show notes, maybe we can drop the 4 Ps just to tell people kind of catch those words. Thank you for your invitation for presence, proximity, powerlessness, and
Proclamation.
Proclamation.
I'm cheating. I have the note.
Okay,
I have it
thanks.
written down right here.
But we really appreciate that. And as maybe for people who are like, okay, yes, this is something I need to do in my life, I want to ask, the question, are are you okay with people asking you questions about, your physical differences, disabilities? What's the best way for people to approach someone with a disability? Because I know it can probably, maybe it's exhausting, watching people feel uncomfortable and they don't know what to say. So how do you recommend for people to past the discomfort, to engage in learning, and how we can kind of approach people who have disabilities? Again, more the visible disabilities.
I don't think there's really any one specific formula or way that
fair
we
enough.
begin that. I think it's really spirit driven, and it's also a matter of discernment, a matter of tact and relational practice. First, I would say again is just you see someone around you who seems to be on the margins of the environment, of the gathering. Just go hang out with them. Mm-hmm. Just spend time with them and start listening to them. Sometimes if you feel you feel that urge, that nudging, invite them to, don't go up, hey, why are you in a wheelchair?
But maybe some people need to hear that, right? Like, because not everyone has the social awareness. So,
well, like I said, not every one formula, but but I think just hey, want to meet up for coffee? I'd love to hear your story.
It's good.
I'd love to hear your story.
I mean, I want to say you can say that to anybody.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is, I think, what's so great about that is it takes out the why are you in a wheelchair question that you should not ask.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's probably one of the easiest ways to do it. Sometimes it's a matter of being really radical, like I shared about my wife's cousin. Invite them radically to your house. I'm going to take the front door off my house so you can be part of family dinner this Sunday, or we're going to move our gathering to a space that is accessible and ready to welcome you to be a part of it. And we're not going to tell you to go join the disabled group over there, or the disabled. Now, I think it's important too, and I want to highlight this too. There needs to be, and I remember talking with Brad Jerzak about this a couple weeks ago, a sense of a cocoon environment. As I mentioned earlier in my story, it was people who struggled with the same struggles I was facing with disability early in my life that helped me realize that life continues. Mm. And I think that, it's easy to create that organic relational calling as I described, but there needs to be also a certain structural physical cocoon environment for people with disabilities, visible disabilities, to perhaps gather in and not only mature and grow with one another and share some of those struggles so that they feel a bit of transformational encouragement. You think of that little caterpillar, it's becoming a butterfly. Well, life in a wheelchair is chaotic and messy and sometimes pretty dark. But knowing you're not alone in that darkness really helps you into becoming that butterfly that God sees in you. And I think that that's where I guess I've been feeling really pushed towards in the coming years is to, how do we shape this cocoon environment that nurtures that community, that network, or whatever you want to call it, for people with disabilities. But also it's a bit porous, so that the greater community of the church and of the tree environment can also nurture and permeate that and say, hey, you're part of a greater story. Right. You're not just segregated off. So yeah, I don't know if that kind of goes off from your guys' question, but I just thought it was important.
And I think it's interesting because when you were first telling your story when you were younger and you were invited to be a pastor with Disabled Ministries, it's interesting when you say that because it seems like you've sort of made, I don't want to say you made peace with that idea, but it sounds like at the beginning of your journey you were like, no, I'm so much more, but you're embracing the actually like, I am a lot more than that, but also I can be part of that community.
Yes. I'll just say yes. I know. It's the old Isaiah, I guess. Yes, Lord, send me.
Yeah.
But I'm kind of holding my head down. Yes. Yes, Lord, send me. I got it.
Yeah. Hey, I think obedience is obedience, right? Whatever it looks like. Yeah. Well, that's awesome.
So I want to ask you this question. Living through life now, like decades later, looking back, what would you say to your 15-year-old self?
These are the words that are coming to mind. I don't know if this is God speaking to me in the moment. Don't limit yourself by fear. Pick up your mat and follow me. It's so easy when you're presented with tragic events and tragic moments, life-altering challenges that you will struggle with for the rest of your life, and say, I'm just going to curl up in a ball. I'm just going to stay here in the safety and choose the safe road. And Jesus says, no, become a radical like me. No, live life to the fullest. Do everything you possibly can in a moment. Because tomorrow you don't know what may happen, what may come. One of the things I guess I've always lived with was the understanding that change is inevitable in life. It's just the ultimate reality. And we see that even in death. Death is not an end. That's the promise Christ gives us. It is a change. So live every last waking second. Don't let fear stop you.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for being here today and sharing your story and just some insights onto some things that we maybe don't, these are questions we maybe don't know how to ask, and maybe we ask them wrong, but these are questions that I think a lot of us have had that we don't know how to vocalize. So thank you for giving your insights and sharing your story.
Yeah, I really appreciate you and your time here and the journey that you've been on, the challenges that you've faced and overcome, and even with your faith journey, your resilience to not give up. And I hope, for our listeners, they will be encouraged by your story. I know they will. So,
is it bad to say that they might be inspired by your story? I know we talked about that. In this context.
Yeah. I actually, Bonnie and I prayed this morning, and the prayer we had was that our conversation inspires the listeners, not mine. Our conversation inspires. So
it's okay to say it.
Yeah.
I hope our conversation
inspired me. This conversation has inspired me, so I'm hopeful it will as well for others. So
thank you for being with us, Erik.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to join you here and find life in the land of the living again.
Thank you. Wow, thank you, Erik, for sharing your story with us and being vulnerable in your own challenges that you have faced and overcome. And I know I've been inspired and challenged in the way that I see and interact with people. One thing that you said that I thought was just something to hold on to and really speaks to your resilience is that you said this. You said, I can find a way. It might be different. And I think that goes, what an encouraging word for, I don't know, maybe you're facing a challenge that you don't know how to get through. And just what a great lesson from Erik that I can find a way. It might be different.
Yeah. And
also just thinking about that we all have disabilities and differences, and we all have certain things that we can't do. And some people, they have visible disabilities, but the truth is we all have things that we can't do. And he asked the question, what are my disabilities? And I think that's something that I still need to reflect on and think of and how I look at other people. I think that, often I ask to see and love others, open my eyes to have a heart for other people. And I think this is one of those podcasts where it really just gives a really great perspective into the challenges that people have faced or are going through.
Yeah, and the fact that he was somebody who says, I like to keep a pretty positive attitude when it comes to being in a wheelchair. And I think to myself, if I went through a fraction of what he went through, I don't know if I'd have the same perspective. Even just losing your mother because of a car accident where you were the driver, I don't mean to say even to minimize it, but that was only part of his story.
Yeah.
And I don't know how I would move past that. And he somehow, I think a lot of it, I think most of it has to do with God just working in his life. But the fact that he's able to say, like, this is a reality and I'm choosing to have life in it. I love that.
Yeah, choosing to have life and knowing that, like, I think for him, knowing that he has a place and a role to play. And for him to encourage us that we all have a place and a role to play.
Yeah. I also loved what he talked about, the 4 Ps, but especially the one that maybe it's just the easiest one for me to think through, but presence. Just, what did he say? Make room for those who have disabilities to be a part of your life. And, you know, tear the roof down or tear the door off if you have to, you know, cut a hole in the roof, that story. And it's like, yeah, you know, maybe it is actually taking the door off the hinges, but maybe it's just taking time when you see somebody with an obvious physical difference and asking them how they're doing, you know. I don't know, for me, sometimes I feel like if I see somebody in a wheelchair, I don't want to treat them differently because I don't want them to think I don't want them to think I think poorly about them, but in a way it's almost like, but in doing that, I'm ignoring them, which is worse, you know? And so, I don't know.
Gave some really great practical tips of, like, literally, and we could do this for anyone, of just, if you feel that nudge to go over and just, like, can you share your story with me? Right? Can I hear, right? Like,
and I think I remember Kristen in the episode, was it episode 2? Where she said that meant the most to her as a single mom, when people would just say, hey, can I hear your story? And so I think that applies to everybody. Like, if we just take the time to say, hey, can I hear your story? It seems like if you first hear it, it's like, well, then you're assuming that somebody has a story to tell, but because of they're in a wheelchair or because they're a single mom or whatever. But the reality is we all have a story to tell. And so it's actually a pretty safe question to ask. And I think I mean, that's what we're doing here on the podcast. That's
I was
why
just
we're
thinking,
sharing
right?
stories.
We're literally sharing story and listening.
Because how much does that change things, right? You hear somebody's experience, and it's like, you know,
You gain perspective.
And he talked about that cocoon. You see the similarities in who we are, like, but you also see that, yeah, we are all different. So yeah, we are all disabled, but the way we are disabled is not the same. And so let's pause and have presence in each other's lives and learn how to support the differences, accept the differences, but also remember what brings us together.
It's good. Thank you, Erik. We appreciate you. And thank you for your time and preparation and helping us learn to love one another more deeply.
Yeah. Thank you, Erik. And if you are listening to this podcast for the first time and you don't already follow the show wherever you're listening to this, we would love it if you would hit subscribe and give us a rating, preferably 5-star, and not because we want to hear how wonderful you think the podcast is, although that would be great, but also because it helps us to be seen, and we would love it if this episode could be heard by other people, by more people. So if you would like, share, subscribe, all those things. And we also want to say a special thank you to our producer, Ryan.
Thank you, Ryan.
We had a lot of questions that we stumbled our words over in this episode, so he had to do a lot of cutting. So thank you, Ryan. We appreciate you.
We appreciate you. Thank you, listeners, for joining us, and we'll we won't hear you, but
you'll hear us later.
You'll hear us later. So thank you for joining us on this journey.
Always feel free to send us an email at podcast@faccalgary.com if you've got questions or comments or feedback about the show. Otherwise, we will talk to you here.
Bye, friends.
Bye.